this event with them. We're talking today about the US elections and the outlook for social media companies under a Biden presidency. And I know we have members online from the Concordia family as well as the Digitalis family. So I'd like to say a little bit about Digitalis and address that community and say just why these issues matter to us. We are one of the world's sort of leading online advisory companies, and we help companies, individuals, and organizations in the challenges of communicating in this new and complicated online world. And for our clients, social media is increasingly the way that they communicate. Of course it is. We all feel that. And online search platforms are the means by which our reputation is collated and brought together. It matters to us. It matters to all of us. A composite of what is said about us online on our Google search defines our reputation. And for our clients, what social media platforms are doing, the whole debate around disinformation, whether domestic or foreign inspired, their policies towards online harms, the algorithms they deploy in determining what is important on their search engines, it's all critical to getting a communication strategy right. And we work with clients to make sure that their narratives online match the ones they believe are fair and accurate. So we've been worrying a lot recently here in the UK about, and working indeed with the British government, on the anti-vax movement and in mapping out their online visibility and impact. And for this movement, the social media platforms are their main voice. It's unusual, unique, different way of approaching this pandemic and public crisis than any preceding it. Social media is the platform, is the voice for these movements. So, do we have this right? Where it's a balance between free speech and social harms? Are the social media platforms really in tune with political and public debate on this? Are they really committed to change? The Brits among us will have seen the recent legislative changes that the British government are proposing to try and regulate social media companies and their content and hold them responsible to it. Is this matter? Does this matter? Will it change? And will it really shift the debate globally? We've got a great panel today, and there's the guys in ties, some of whom you can see, and Sophie as well. And I'm going to have Matt Swift introducing you all in a moment. We've got around 40 minutes. Some quick housekeeping tips. Whether you like it or not, all attendees have been automatically muted on entry. So when we get to the Q&A, if the timing and the debate allows it, then we'll use that feature really to ask those questions. Do use chat, but on the whole, we're going to hope to try and put the questions on the Q&A platform at the end of it. You can, of course, also raise your hand during the Q&A. You know that thing. Not that well. Press your button, and we'll unmute you and call you with time permitting. And it's great to have so many people here from such a varied range of backgrounds and interests, our clients, our friends, on both sides of the Atlantic. And I'd really like to thank Matthew Swift for doing this, for Nicholas Logothetis, and the Concordia team for co-hosting this conversation this afternoon and this morning for some of you. So can I now turn it over to Matthew Swift, co-founder, chairman, and CEO, to start the proceedings.
Thank you very, very much, Richard. And I have to say, you could not think of a more important topic than what we are talking about today in terms of the future of social media platforms, a shift in administrations in the United States, but also some very important, critical, fundamental questions about these social media platforms, how governments, how the public sector should approach these social media platforms, and also really thinking through who is the moral authority when it comes to content. Where do we find that guiding force, if you will, in terms of content out there for the public sphere? And how do we approach that? So we could not have a better panel today. And Richard, thank you very, very much, the Deputy Chairman of Digitalis. Digitalis, which is led by Dave King, has been a member of Concordia for a long time. It is a fantastic company. It's really the leading digital intelligence and communications advisory business, in the UK, but I would also say globally. We've worked on a number of different projects over the years, including the work you've done on counter-extremism with governments all around the world, and how you combat extremism, especially online, which is very important. And so this conversation coming at this time, when you see Twitter flagging certain tweets and then not flagging other tweets, and when you see Facebook taking a completely different strategy than Twitter when it comes to flagging misinformation and various pieces of content out there. There's a lot to discuss. There's a lot to debate. And this conversation for the Digitalis and Concordia community, I think, is going to really further how we talk about these issues. Before we go to Josh Rogan and Anna Sophie Harling, I'd like to start with you, Richard. First and foremost, as I mentioned, Deputy Chairman of Digitalis. Set the stage for us in this conversation from a broad perspective. What do you see as, say, the top 2 or 3 significant potential changes in how the Biden administration is going to approach social media platforms versus how the Trump administration has approached social media platforms?
I know I'm venturing into US territory, which you guys all are a great deal more expert on than me. But I think we have we come into this debate post-election with possibly the one social issue that combined both the Democrat and the Republican Party. This is a sector that needs something done to it, both in terms of its size, its dominance, the monopoly position of some of the major players in it. But I think a collective understanding that the quality of political discourse is being upset by the models that social media naturally bring to debate. And I think it's partly that sort of unfettered and quite often anonymized capability that is given to citizens to contribute. There's a huge amount of good that comes out of this in reviving political discourse and debate in all of our countries, in Western democracies. So I think all feel slightly, perhaps jaded and under threat from other social models. And social media does often offer an opportunity for a greater connectivity between voters and their leaders. But there has been a sense in which social media has really resulted in silos of common thinking emerging without really the opportunities for those silos to interact and engage and learn from others. And I think that model is pernicious and is a difficult one, and allows misinformation and disinformation to lodge in the national consciousness and national debate. So I think that is a broader issue, which the good thinkers and the long-term thinkers of both sides of the political divide in the US will, I think, understand to be a common problem. Solutions are difficult ones, but that sense of the quality of political discourse, it was addressed imperfectly during the election, as Matt said, in terms of the varying policies of the platforms. But how do we sort that out is a critical issue. I think in the UK there are other issues around social harms, children's access to websites, etc. A whole issue that has a particular potency in terms of the UK political debate. So if we could just perhaps focus on that issue. The second one I would add to that, I think, would be the national security dimension. And I don't think this needs to be necessarily the subject of today, but the sense that foreign governments have the capacity to shift political discourse across borders. You no longer need to drive a tank into a country to occupy and change the minds of its citizens. You can do a great deal more online. You can do it cheaply, effectively, and you don't need the technological advance and dominance that former ways of imposing your will and advancing kinetic power necessitated. This is cheap, it is easy, and it can be done. And we're finding that countries without our technological traditions have a capability to undermine our systems and those perceptions of voters about the tangibility, about the control and the power of our democratic systems. That is a critical issue that I think the social media companies are taking on board. Those are the two issues I suggest, Matthew.
No, and I think, Richard, you brought up some very important points. One of the things you talked about is how cheap it is for governments to be able to advance misinformation. I remember from some of the reporting around Russia's interference in the 2016 election, they would spend $100 on an ad and it could change the entire perception of an entire community. And so for not a lot of money, you can cause a great deal of harm. I'd like to move to Anna Sophie Harling, who is the NewsGuard Technologies Managing Director in Europe. First off, let's talk a little bit about NewsGuard. You apply, if you will, a bit of a notice when it comes to how sources are flagged, how information is flagged. And I want to talk about that because I think in the US, we even have television programs that might be news during the day, but then all of a sudden shift to opinion at night, and viewers might not necessarily know whether it's opinion or news. And we see certainly the same thing on social media. But with your focus specifically on Europe, do you see Europe as a bit of setting the world standard for how we will be flagging misinformation on social media going forward?
I think so. I think I'm a bit biased answering that question, as I'm a member of Ofcom's content board, which has just been handed a lot of power in terms of making decisions on where regulation will go with regards to the online harms that Richard had mentioned. But I think between the UK's online harms legislation and the UK's legislation and the EU's new Digital Services Act and some of what they're doing around antitrust, I wouldn't be surprised if the Biden administration takes a lot of its direction from what's happening in the UK and Europe moving forwards.
And from your perspective, if you can, talk a little bit about NewsGuard, though, and the work you're doing. Can you explain a bit for this community that we're talking to this morning, a bit about what your business does? Sure. We welcome the shameless plug, please.
No, it's okay. NewsGuard is a company that rates the reliability of news and information websites. Mm-hmm. So we've established 9 criteria of credibility and transparency. And then we use teams of human analysts, so former journalists, who apply those 9 criteria apolitically to news and information websites. And we supply what we call nutrition labels for news websites. And our consumer-facing browser extension integrates those ratings directly into people's social media feeds and browser search results. The idea being that we encourage users to think critically about where their information is coming from, who is behind the websites they're seeing online. And in many ways, I guess it's an alternative to fact-checking in that it aggregates the credibility of the sources at the source level, tries to teach people that if you're evaluating information, it's important to know, who is behind that information, what might their financial motivations be, do they have a political agenda, have they been flagged by fact-checking organizations in the past, what are their editorial standards and their transparency practices.
Got it. Okay. Thank you very, very much for that. I want to switch real quick to Josh Rogan, who's a columnist for the Washington Post. I am a consistent reader of Josh's column, and I point everybody to one of his latest columns titled "Trump Bashes Defense Bill as Pro-China Baffling Washington." Josh, also, you've got a book coming out in March, but let's go straight to let's talk about the United States and what U.S. government officials are looking at doing to combat foreign intelligence interference as it relates to U.S. elections. Can we talk a little bit about that? What did you see from 2016? What have you seen in this last election here? Do you see the situation getting worse, getting better? And what do you see as a proactive stance from the incoming administration?
Sure. Thanks so much. It's a big question, a big topic. And let me first say thanks to Concordia. Your events are always great. Pleasure to be a part of them. Thanks to Anna and Sophie for trying to do the job of educating the public on media literacy and encouraging transparency in education and disclosure, which I think is crucial to solving this big problem. What I witnessed from 2016 to 2020 is a total disaster of first failing to understand, then failing to acknowledge, then failing to respond to what is ultimately a series of coordinated, well-funded nation-state attacks on our information environment. Okay, and for a lot of reasons that a lot of people on this webinar already understand, the what I just said, the idea that this was actually a planned operation, a set of operations by a set of countries that wish to do harm not just to the United States but to all free and open societies is true, but was politicized and distorted by a variety of domestic and international actors for a variety of reasons that we don't need to relitigate right now. But what I see now 4 years later is that while many individual institutions and actors who are affected by this have proceeded in parallel stovepipe efforts to find patches or remedies or prophylactics to mitigate the damage done by this. We've failed to come together as a community, much less as a government or as a society or as a group of societies to have a coordinated, wholesome, effective, sustainable approach. And so while we can always sort of look at the tactics that were used in the last war and find ways to resist those tactics, we're failing to understand how those tactics are evolving and actually expanding, and the range of actors that are attacking us are expanding well past what they were in 2016. I think that leads perfectly to the article that you just mentioned that I wrote on yesterday in the Washington Post, which was about repeal of Section 230 of the 1996 Communications Act, which is a prize of conservatives and Republicans on the Hill, especially the President of the United States. Now, you could say that he's interested in that because he's mad at Twitter for labeling his own disinformation, and I'm sure that's true, but there's also a lot of good faith Republicans and conservatives who believe that this is the best way to proceed in putting some sort of regulation around these tech platforms and invoking the sort of basic principle that deciding what is true and what is news and what is shareable is not really a private function, that at some point there has to be some sort of public input put on that, and we just can't let these tech companies decide what's what. It's just not a great idea for a variety of reasons. But what happened? They tried to drop the repeal of Section 230, the administration rather, into the defense bill, which it has very little, if anything, to do with, at the last minute at the end of the conference committee. And for people on Capitol Hill that I talked to for this article, they said, well, that was never going to work. That doesn't make sense for a lot of process and policy reasons. You can't do it. It's not the right jurisdiction. It doesn't work that way. It would have taken a lot more buy-in. And this is typical of how the Trump administration went about these things. They decided that they could bully the Congress into doing the thing that they wanted at the 11th hour during the lame duck after they lost the election. And then, when they didn't get their way, they took their ball and went home and threatened. Now they're going to veto the defense bill, which is like a pay raise for the troops, over their failed gambit to repeal Section 230, which, set aside the merits of repealing 230, that gambit was a bad gambit. Okay,
Sure.
It always was a bad gambit. So what they've done is actually ensure that they won't actually make any progress on this issue, at least in the way that they wish, and they've actually hyper politicized the idea of repealing Section 230 such that it is politically untouchable for a Biden administration to take an approach that would be anything like that. What's kind of funny is that meanwhile the disinformation that President Trump has been spreading, that Twitter has been flagging, especially regarding to the election, but not only regarding the election, is amplified intentionally by those very nation state actors that are seeking to sow discord into our political discussion, including China and Russia and others. So the calls coming from inside the house, and if you, on top of that, when the Chinese embassy got caught last week for retweeting Trump's election disinformation, they were embarrassed. They actually unretweeted it and they said they were hacked, which was a lie, because it's always a lie when you say your Twitter got hacked. So they're more concerned about being caught spreading disinformation than the President of the United States, which is just an oddity of our political system that's about to end. So I guess what I'm saying is that although we have like a broad bipartisan consensus that something needs to be done, there's no consensus at all on what that should be. And basically the Biden administration has to start from scratch, dealing with its own inter-party, internascent fighting over this issue, which divides centrists and progressives along predictable lines.
But Anna Sophie, as Josh is talking about, there is bipartisan consensus that something needs to happen, that something needs to be done. But surely there's justified skepticism from the public, from consumers, from the executives of social media companies to say, is government fully prepared and ready to take that battle on? And how is it an equal playing field among the different platforms? What advice would you be giving the incoming administration in terms of how you approach this, given that skepticism? We might all agree we need to address this problem, but surely we can all also agree that the skepticism is probably pretty valid at this point.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, I was going to ask Josh, actually. So Biden has already said he wants to revoke Section 230, but it seems highly unlikely that he's going to actually revoke the entire thing for the reasons that Josh mentioned. I think it'll fall somewhere in the middle where, he could, do nothing, or he could decide the US is going to regulate all speech, would be extremely un-American, and they're never going to let that happen. So I think what will happen, and what I guess the tech platforms are currently pushing for, is an in-between approach where the tech platforms acknowledge that change is coming, and so they'd at least like to be part of, what that is, and rather than a complete, revoking of 230, they're going to try to sort of tweak it around the edges. And that might be something similar along, impose some kind of duty of care whereby, if the platforms can show a good faith effort in protecting consumers, then they'll have a free pass, but they have to, show that they're doing something, and what that something is, that's sort of remains to be seen. They could do something along the lines of what the UK wants platforms to do. So, that's to demonstrate that they're safeguarding consumers by either removing certain types of extreme content or labeling content. There will likely be a greater push for something like transparency measures. So transparency around how do algorithms work, what is the information that I'm seeing and why, transparency around advertising. So those are all measures that both Zuckerberg and Dorsey have supported, and at least verbally. We don't know what they're saying behind closed doors. But I can very much imagine that the platforms will want to be in the room where the decisions are made, and we can, all signs point to them lobbying quite heavily, both in Europe and in the US, to make sure that when those changes happen, they happen according to what the platforms want.
Right. I think that's very interesting. I have a couple of specific reactions to what you just said. First of all, if we're just talking narrowly about a repeal of a law, well, that repealing of a law requires legislative action. So that depends heavily on who controls the Senate. And we won't know that until the Georgia Senate elections play out. If it seems more than likely than not that Republicans hold control of the Senate, I don't know, but in that scenario, we can take all of the legislative remedies pretty much off the table, because we will be facing a situation where we'll have widespread policy and political and legislative paralysis in Washington for 2 years, if not 4. And so then we'll have to look towards other remedies and other avenues. Now, that's not to say that nothing can happen, but what you're talking about, I think you're getting into an area that actually came up a lot in my reporting of my new book, Chaos Under Heaven, a look at the Trump administration's 4 years of dealing with Xi Jinping and the rise of the People's Republic of China, available for pre-order now wherever books are sold. And when I talk to a lot of these platforms, they said the same thing, is that their biggest concern right now is not the United States, it's Europe. And they're concerned about all the things, and data sovereignty and taxes and the OSCE tax initiative. And what they want is some sort of government-to-government engagement between the Biden administration and our European allies. That wasn't possible under Trump because the relations were so soured, and they wanted, a reinvigoration of, at least they claim to want it, reinvigoration of multilateral institutions like the ITF to push back against the ITU and internet government forums. And, they often note to me that, with the UK as the president of the G7 and the UK government's idea of a T10, not a D10 of democracies, a T10 of techno-democracies that can coordinate what the heck we're doing in order to combat the shared threat of the rise of digital authoritarianism and digital despotism. And that relates to 5G and all of the other big issues that we're all confronting right now, all separately. Okay, so I think in that sense, that's like a much clearer and much bigger opportunity for a Biden administration that claims to want to revitalize alliances with Europe, and we could actually find a lot of common ground, not a total common ground, in solving some of these problems. And that also has the side benefit of, stopping the rise of digital authoritarianism, which is a national security issue, a public health issue, as we're finding out, and a human rights issue.
Yeah, that's interesting, Josh. I mean, I think that's right. Although, of course, it demands, a similar degree of sort of coherence and common thinking among European countries as to this being an issue that they're going to take forward. And I think, that comes and goes. And I think given the challenges facing the EU over the next couple of years, I wonder how high that's going to be in the agenda.
Absolutely. I mean, I think the tech executives that I talked to were concerned about what's going on in France. But, again, that I'm not claiming to be an expert in European tax policy. I'm just saying that, if we're facing policy and legislative paralysis in Washington, we might find a lot of opportunity and common ground and room to run. And, and if we're going to revitalize European alliances anyway, this seems like a pretty good place to start. And that doesn't mean that the issues of digital privacy or, internet sovereignty are agreed upon. As you note rightly, Richard, even in Europe, there's no agreement whatsoever on how to approach these things. But we got to start this conversation. We got to realize that we have some shared interests and some shared values here. And there's no way to fight the rise of digital authoritarianism and digital despotism one by one. It's not going to work. We're going to need to join together sooner or later. So we might as well get started. That's my opinion.
Yeah, I think at least we have from the social media companies in Europe taking a more mature approach to their engagement with European governments. We're from where we were 5 years ago, where there was no dialogue. The engagement might be a slightly stilted one at present, but they are talking in a way they weren't. So that's some positive benefits.
One example that came up in my reporting was, when Mark Zuckerberg came to Washington last October, right before the pandemic, and, he got bashed by both sides. It was like one of those congressional hearings where it's just a slaughter, right? And, rightly so. Don't get me wrong. I'm not excusing Facebook from any of the, harm that it's enabling or complicit in our society. But what Mark Zuckerberg was actually there to do is to argue for a common approach against, Chinese expansion of Chinese Communist Party tech principles in free societies. And his example is the Libra, but you could say it's self-motivated by, the threat of TikTok or whatever. I'm sure he's got a lot of self-interested reasons for pushing that, but nevertheless, late and self-interested as he is, Zuckerberg's right about that. Okay, we need to, it's much better to have systems like financial payment systems based on some sort of system that we have some sort of influence on, rather than letting the Chinese Communist Party establish a system that takes into consideration none of our interests and none of our values.
So given that we have just wrapped up, well, I guess to most people we've wrapped up a U.S. election. Let's shift gears a little bit, and I want to direct this next question to Richard, talking a little bit about your take on the vaccine. The vaccine is rolling out. The UK was the first to give the first dose of the vaccine, then Canada, and now the United States. But the rollout of the vaccine is a huge opportunity for those trying to do harm and to spread misinformation. How do you approach social media platforms when talking about the vaccine movement, but also not inhibit free speech?
Well, that's you've bottled the challenge there to some extent. I think let's take pause and give some credit to the distance that the social media companies have moved in the last year, but even acknowledging the role they play in this. They have moved over the last half decade from what I call West Coast anti-federalism, in which they've believed it to their right to define these things, and governments and states having no authority in this space. And a free, unfettered commons on ideas is what these companies were set up to try and generate. So we do at least, I think, have a shift of principle in the sense of them responsibility in this area. So let's thank them for that. And certainly the more recent initiatives from Facebook and others have been positive. They do understand the consequences of an unfettered debate, unfettered language and conversations on their platforms on these issues and the way that they are shifting perceptions. But we start off in the UK at least, and we can argue about whether it's 30, 40 or 50% of the population who are skeptical about the benefits of vaccination, or whether it's going to be 20, 30 or 40% of the population that have stated emphatically at this stage they're not going to take it. And that's partly a credible, in that sense, scientific skepticism. But it's partly a bundle of, one might say, identity issues, which being anti-vax goes along with a set of anti-authority positions and political positions on a whole range of things. And in the fractious political worlds that we all live in, you can see how oppositionalism in that sense to the state and to authority is wrapped up in this argument. So how does one get governments to do anything about this? And we're working hard to persuade them. And of course, there's a natural, entirely sort of forgivable reaction from many governments, indeed from many pharma companies, saying if we could only just counter irrational science with rational science, we'll change people's point of view. I'm just not sure that it always works like that. It will work like that at the fringes, but these people have, been faced, these communities, and there are many of them, have been faced by rational science for a long time and mistrust it generally because it's given in someone wearing a white coat from a position of authority they instinctively mistrust. So unless we actually engage with, I think, the social media companies to begin to curtail access to this sort of information, it won't get anywhere. And I think the policies are great ones. I think their capacity to actually roll them out and to be effective with them is partial for varying reasons of good and bad motives, but it isn't working well enough and fast enough. And I think the government has to, both at the same time as encouraging progress, act to call them out for times when they are failing. But Anna Sophie is also doing quite a lot of stuff in this news card space. It's a really interesting issue.
No, but I was going to say, Anna Sophie, do you see a situation where we're putting almost too much emphasis or reliance on these very, very large private companies or, public companies, but these social media companies? And does it take, other smaller businesses coming in and providing the kind of services that you're providing, or do you see something more direct coming from the public sector to address this?
That is a really good question. So I guess a couple of things. You need the buy-in of the tech platforms. Yep. That is where the audiences are. And you see this as well in the anti-vax communities. And I would say on some of the more trust-eroding communities, such as QAnon, which have made their way over to Europe, which exist to sort of diminish trust in credible organizations and, the World Health Organization and governments. They want to be on the big tech platforms because that's where the unenlightened are. That is where the mainstream audiences are that they're trying to reach and convince with their theories. And so, there's an argument to be made that, if those fringe communities move over to Parler and Gab and some of the smaller platforms, maybe that's okay. Maybe they can just stay there. And then, all the people that are on Facebook to share dog photos and talk to their families can continue doing so in peace without having, Facebook's algorithm pushing them towards certain types of content. As someone who works for a smaller company that's trying to address these issues, I think there's loads of room for small innovative firms like ours who have, different ways of approaching this. And I think there's a lot of value in having an independent third-party organization making decisions about content, either in addition to or instead of, Facebook's internal team or other social media firms. And, in the UK, we have a really thriving, safety tech community, which I think the UK government is extremely proud of and wants to support. But none of that is any help if we don't get the tech platforms to actually work with us. That is where, you said the public sector, that's where government comes in. Mm-hmm. But I think, the one good thing that's come out of 2020 is that, it's the year in which we actually woke up to the realities of the dangers of misinformation. It's no longer just a funny joke when Donald Trump calls fake news between 5G, vaccine, COVID, and the dangers of people believing strangers on the internet. We are starting to see the real world harms of misinformation. And I think, personally, I think that's why we saw misinformation get so much airtime in the online harms response that came out this week, which is that for the first time, the governments have said, whoa, we didn't know if this was going to be in scope, but it kind of has to be now because it is one of those real world harms alongside, bullying and child pornography and terrorism. It does result in lives and actually people getting hurt. The only shame I would say is that, with anti-vax stuff, we're only now deciding to start combating it, when in reality, this stuff has been picking up steam and has been sort of spreading unfettered for months, if not, since April.
But I asked this to the entire panel here for a second, because what is the concern that we are asking for the impossible? And I want to take a moment to read you this headline from the People's Daily in China, and get your all's reaction. The headline is, all available evidence suggests that COVID-19 did not start in central China's Wuhan, but may come into China through imported frozen food products and their packaging. And that received no warning, no disclaimer at all from Twitter. So are we not essentially, one, asking something of these companies that they're never going to be able to do, and two, as governments around the world try and grapple with this and all have different strategies and approaches to this, asking them to do something that's completely impossible. Josh, let's start with you.
Yeah, I think having covered that issue very closely, first of all, I think there is a warning. It says Chinese state-affiliated media with a flag on the tweet. That's not the same as the disinformation specific warning to the tweets that President Trump has put out regarding the election results. So I think there's a legitimate criticism that these warnings and transparency measures are being applied inconsistently, but I don't believe, actually being a very staunch critic of the Chinese Communist Party and its disinformation, I still don't see that as a intentional effort by tech platforms to promote Chinese propaganda, as has been alleged by some Republicans, and maybe by the president, if we're to understand his veto threat in that way. And I think there's a huge, downside risk of over politicizing and the China challenge and the threat of China's rise, which I'm very concerned about. Just wrote a whole book about the link of which is now in your chat for pre-order. But I do think that we have to again come at this issue honestly, and honestly, it's not really Twitter promoting the Chinese government. It's the fact that their system is arbitrary and run by human beings who are fallible. Okay, and that's the nature of any system. And I haven't checked my own rating on Anna Sophie's system, but I hope it's somewhere in the range of credible. But then again, if it's not, I'm not going to take that personally, because again, this is a system ultimately run by humans and who are making choices and judgments. And so there is no silver bullet. If you guys all saw the Netflix special, right? You can fight bad information with good information, but all of the tubes and pipes and algorithms are set up in a way that climbing that hill is just too difficult for the vast majority of human beings. And I think that's ultimately what we have to get at here, is we have to rejigger the pipes so that the good information has a fighting chance against the bad information in ways that humans writing stories or looking at stories and giving them ratings are just never going to be able to solve on a case-by-case basis, right? That's like sort of digging out the ocean with a teaspoon. Okay, it's not going to work in the long run. And the other part here is that I think that in the end, fighting a Chinese government propaganda machine or a Russian government propaganda machine or Iranian or North Korean or whatever is not the job of the tech companies. It's the job of the government. Okay. That's a government function, okay, because it's a government to government, it's a Chinese government attack or a Russian government attack on our country and our democracy. So I feel like there's a lot of passing the buck in Congress and the government. Oh, well, the tech companies didn't clean up the Chinese information operation. Yeah, of course they didn't. Okay, why do we expect them to be national security experts? Now, there's another side to that story, which is that the tech companies, the national security agencies have a terrible relationship, which the national security agencies bear a lot of responsibility for ruining. Not that we're going to get into that right now, but this is again an argument for sort of a reset, a public-private partnership, and then a refocus on what the real priority of the threat is here. And once we determine I happen to believe that the priority of the threat is to first clean up our information. Let's take the problems one, in order of magnitude, and this two, a superpower and a regional power, bringing to bear billions of dollars to screw with our minds through our own media and our own social media. That's to me, that seems like the biggest thing. Okay, and that's again going to require us to put aside some of these squabbles and to find a way to work between government and these tech platforms, and then find a way to work with other free and open societies. That seems to me to be the only way to get at that bigger problem. And then, if we happen to need to solve some of these smaller problems in order to get to them, all the better.
I was listening to a fantastic interview between David Axelrod and the legendary journalist Dan Rather, and Dan Rather was saying, based on the challenge that the media industry has had in being able to adapt to to the internet, to social media platforms, and the pressure even put on highly reputable news sources to get more clicks because of those algorithms is increasingly difficult. This next question, Anna, Sophie, to you, is the answer just simply to come up with a new system to regulate the algorithms? And is that an incredibly naive question on my part?
Not naive. I think it's an important question. The regulation of algorithms sounds complicated. I think, again, that's an area in which transparency can go a long way. I think one of the things that NewsGuard always says is that we're one of several companies that produces credibility ratings for news organizations, and our main competitors are Facebook and Google, because they have their own internal rating system for how they rank all of these different websites, except that no one has any idea how that works and who's making those decisions. And if you're a news website, you can't call up Facebook and go, what's my credibility rating and how do I improve it? Yeah. So, from our standpoint, you can go a long way by making, by at least opening things up and saying, this is why we've made this decision on this type of content. This is why you're seeing this website at the top of your newsfeed. At this point, users have no idea why they're seeing certain types of content. There's a shockingly large percentage of young people in the US who don't realize that Facebook isn't a news outlet and doesn't have their own reporters. So I think, going back to Josh's point, from a media literacy standpoint, there is a lot that platforms can do, even, without regulation, in terms of, helping to equip users with more information about why they're seeing what they're seeing and making informed choices about those types of content. And that will also then, force the tech platforms to make more intelligent choices when it becomes very obvious that a lot of why what we're seeing is driven by clicks and attention and, misinformation that, ensures that people spend maximum amounts of time online, but overall is pretty bad for our information ecosystem. So yeah, I think, regulating the algorithm is something that I guess we'll try, and that seems to be where we might be headed in the UK. But I think, as we're seeing today, there was a big decision around, Twitter and privacy, but the decision took 2 years to make. And, that's not really a time frame in which we can be regulating big tech, right? Yeah. And the same thing is true with algorithms. How are you going to try to regulate algorithms that are changing every day? And if, you submit a complaint against an algorithm and the decision is rendered 2 years later, that's 2 years in which an algorithm might be doing a lot of harm. So I think that will be the challenge, is trying to come up with regulation that can move swiftly, keep up, and also bears, mentioning is the regulation has to be created by people who understand the tech and are tech savvy enough to avoid situations in which we might be questioning CEOs of tech companies and not understanding what their products are and how they work.
I think it was a senator from the US that at the beginning of a hearing asked the question of what is the difference between Twitter and Facebook. So hear you loud and clear on that front. Richard, though, for you, for Digitalis, and last question, and then we'll move to the viewers' questions that have been coming in, and I urge everybody who's watching to post a question through the Q&A feature. But Richard, Digitalis' business in many ways was created because the algorithms of Google automatically elevate the negative. So what is your advice as it relates to potential government regulation to the algorithm specifically?
Difficult one. I think on my bad days, I think we may be just having to learn to live in a post-truth world and structure around that. I think there are, I do think points of Josh, we have some challenges to meet in terms of the quality of our own political dialogue within our own countries that we can do a lot to address. We can do a lot, I think, to be more collective on it, and the T10 or the D10, getting democratic societies to understand the importance of this and to combine around this, I think, is another thing. And of course, technology moves on and AI moves on, and we can imagine this in 10 years' time, can this issue be solved by technology rather so these companies are actually run by computers rather than people. But I think for Digitalis, the issue is not so much. It is partly managing an inert and unthinking algorithm that not necessarily emphasizes the negative, but emphasizes those issues that attract enough clicks and enough attention, which of course is the basic business model these organizations operate on. So it's hard to see how that can be addressed without these companies going out of business. I mean, they need to reward attention. I think there is a lot more that companies and individuals can do to take responsibility for their narrative on the internet, and to shape it, and to be more cautious about what they say, to be more disciplined about what they say, and understanding that there's a way of ensuring that shop window through which we're seen these days, which is that screen, that 10 points, those 10 points on your Google, that they are saying the things about you that you want to have said. So manage your narrative, think about your narrative from that technological point of view, rather than just from a content point of view. So I think it's a fascinating new area for all of us. And PR and digital is moving online. Digital communications is properly moving online, and I think we will begin to see companies and individuals looking more adventurously at how that picture of their narrative is shaped by their online digital profile. So it's good. It's all good stuff for us. But as I say, the broader environment, I have to say I would be concerned about.
So wrapping up in 10 minutes, let's go to the questions that have come in. So from Keith Oliver and Josh, I think this question first goes to you because it also connects to, I think, Section 230. But Keith Oliver asked, the tech giants have very successfully resisted all attempts to regulate them and hold them to account. Do you think it will require the imposition of international criminal liability and possible imprisonment of their directors to effect a sea change in their approach and responsibility for the serial spread of misinformation? Josh?
Well, me first. I find it, interesting, but, kind of odd that, people talk about international criminal liability in this context, because, that's its own nest of, debate and contradiction in and of itself. I mean, on the one hand, I'm for the United States Justice Department, indicting and scooping up as many online criminals in foreign countries, especially authoritarian countries who are attacking our democracy, as possible, and if you find that Russian hacker or that Chinese hacker or that, Moldovan or whatever it is, and you can get at him, yeah, scoop that guy up and throw him in jail and punish him for his crimes. Now, that's a little bit different than some sort of like international, governing body that's going to impose some sort of international law, which I don't think that is, politically possible even in the United States or logistically likely, given the state of the international community such as it is, which is why I think we have to, as I said a little bit before, start with a buy-in approach. Okay, we have to start with the low-hanging fruit and what we can agree on, and that can be standards, okay, and norms and practices, and these standards bodies are also under attack by authoritarian regimes who wish to steer the standards towards their national champion companies, which don't abide by Western liberal, small L liberal values, much less abide by standards of data privacy, human rights, et cetera, et cetera. So, let's start there. I'm not against law enforcement. I'm saying that, like, practically, if we could get the countries that at least agree on having, rule of law, transparency, accountability in some sense, and, basic protection of human rights online, I bet I could name those 10 or 12 countries, and we get them all in the room together. That's a big first step. And then, for sure, I think it's going to basically just be up to the U.S. government, right, at least for now, but hopefully some other governments will join in taking the worst of the worst actors and, exposing them, naming them and shaming them, and then indicting them. And then if they step foot in a country that's willing to arrest them, to scoop them up and put them behind bars. I'm for that, absolutely, for sure.
Richard, should executives of tech companies face potential criminal court indictment?
It was played around with in some of the white papers leading up to the UK proposed legislation for next year, and as I've noticed, has been backed away from or held in reserve. I mean, I just wonder, given the scale of these companies, whether you wave that around as a threat, but it's simply not going to be effective. And I think as most of these companies for the foreseeable future are going to be US owned and domiciled, unless you do that with the agreement with the US government, I can't see that it will be effective. And I sort of coming back to Josh's point, I think there has to be still an assumption of good intent on their part, and a dialogue that can be built. They can be nudged into being more cooperative and more engaged. Legislation can nudge them further. I'm not sure criminalizing the leadership is going to be helpful, but I on the other hand, I also think that raising the issue of criminalizing the leadership is probably intending to focus people's minds. So that in itself may not be bad, but I'm not sure its practical effect is one that we can depend on.
Let's go to this next question. I think, Anna Sophie, this question straight to you from John Benitez at the International Peace Institute. I think it's clear that regulation is needed with respect to the large social media platforms, i.e. Facebook and Twitter. I'm curious how the Biden administration handles niche smaller companies such as Parler. How do we combat misinformation in these echo chambers and growing domestic radicalization?
Well, I don't know about the Biden administration. I think they might have their hands full at the moment with trying to sort out some of the bigger platforms. I think when it comes to some of the smaller platforms, we're starting to see movement in Europe in trying to, figure out how to tackle, the medium and smaller size tech platforms alongside some of the bigger ones. And that includes, some of the medium tier platforms that will be subject to the same regulation and are starting to wonder, if I only have one policy person or one content moderator, how am I going to be able to keep up with regulation in the same way as a big tech platform that has tens of thousands of people, scouring videos and online content. But I guess the ultimate question is, is it worse to try to regulate and work with platforms that, are at least have a seat at the table and are engaging with you than, the people who might be running Parler, who seem to have absolutely no intention and, actually exist in order to circumvent or bypass or replace, what they see as Facebook's own censorship. And I think you see that here in the UK with the emergence of platform like BitChute, which, is by definition, the platform on which all YouTube videos that have been rejected by YouTube will then find a home. And they have their own quote unquote standards of content where they don't hold up. And I think it'll be a big question here in the UK is that is a UK based platform, and how will they be regulated, and can they be regulated? And how do you force a company that has no content moderators, or maybe just one, to keep up with regulation? And if not, do you shut them down? Do you fine them, 10% of their income? And what if they don't care? And so I think it's kind of the devil that you know and the one that you don't know, or whatever the saying is, which is, I have no idea. I think, Josh, you'd made this point yesterday, which is that, take all the crazies and put them on Parler and let them run around there. But then you do have situations in which, you get extremist content that then leads to real world harms. And so, do you have at least someone who's kind of keeping an eye on Parler and making sure that things don't get out of hand? I think, that's where government comes in again and has to at least make sure from a terrorism point of view that things are, under control. But I think that will sort of probably go the same way as, 4chan, 8chan, 8kun, which is, when in doubt, you can pull the plug and shut the whole thing down. Facebook is a bit beyond that point at this point.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. So closing question as we wrap up, and let's start with you, Josh. When President Trump leaves office on January 20th, will Twitter kick him off?
I seriously doubt that. The bottom line is that, I think most of these tech companies are trying to find a way to have their cake and eat it too, to satisfy the left and the right. And when I look around the Washington lobbying scene, what I see is that all of these companies, staffing up on both sides. Okay, they're not looking at the Biden administration and be like, oh well, we got to just hire a bunch of Democratic lobbyists. Now they're hiring everybody. Okay, they realize they've got problems on the left and the right, and they're throwing millions of dollars at both sides. Okay, and what is that tell you? It tells you that they're not trying to be the enemy of Donald Trump. They're trying not to be the enemy of Donald Trump, but they're getting pressured into it, and they're trying to manage two conflicting ideas, and they're doing it very poorly, it seems, because they're satisfying neither side. So what does kicking Donald Trump off Twitter get them except more criticism and a confirmation of a lot of the accusations that the people on the right are making? And I think, in the end, it's like when you talk about Parler and Gab and all these, I think I say let 1,000 flowers bloom. I say, and even odious speech, remember, is a tradition in this country that it's okay, and we should defend it and actually fight for the right for odious speech, even hate speech, to be legal and permissible. But that doesn't mean I want it in my feed, right? So if they want to put all of the odious speech in a different feed and I could ignore that feed, that sounds good to me, right? But you're not allowed to incite violence, and there are limits, and you can't yell fire in a crowded theater. And so, yes, there has to be some limits to free speech, and having those two complicated ideas in our head was just too, sophisticated for the Trump Twitter feed to handle, okay? And they were conflated. And I think what we'll see is hopefully a change in the discussion, but that change doesn't mean that we take Donald Trump or even attempt to take Donald Trump out of the discussion. I don't think he would go even if we tried.
Although it could be helpful to Parler's business. Anna, Sophie, do you political divisions in the U.S., it's not just in the U.S., it's taking place all around the world. Do you see social media giants actively, potentially banning certain politicians in different countries going forward?
Well, with regards to Trump specifically, I think after Twitter hands over the @POTUS account to Joe Biden, I think there's a world in which Trump might not even really join Twitter, and he will either get Newsmax or One America News Network on board and form his own new Trump platform. And then he will definitely not need Twitter, right? He will find some other way to make sure he remains part of political discourse. I'm sure there are tens of millions of people who would prefer that over Twitter and would happily leave Twitter to join, whatever thing Trump is running. And I'm sure through that network and through those videos, he will reach people on Twitter regardless. With regards to Europe, yeah, I don't know. It's really difficult to predict what any of the policies of the platforms are. They seem to be changing all the time, and it's difficult to know, what they're reacting to, whether it's their shareholders or the advertising community or regulation. I guess that remains to be seen.
Richard, what do you think? Think social media platforms might start kicking some anti-vaxxers off sometime soon?
I would be optimistic on that. I think it's a kicking an anti-vaxxer off has slightly less political potency than getting rid of a president of the United States. And there is more identifiable and clearly sort of definable social harms that come from their narrative. I think the rollout of the vaccines over the next 12 months is bound to be a great deal rockier than we think it's going to be. And by the time we get to the end of it, questions of equity, questions of effectiveness, questions of whether or not, of how we manage this minority of the population that will continue to refuse to take it on are going to be big issues. And I think the increasing pressures on the social media companies who already moved a significant distance in accepting that they do have the capacity to influence this debate, I think will shift things. So my concern is probably less the policy or their pronouncements, their capacity to actually give effect to what it is they say they're going to do. But we have to continue to nudge, and governments continue to have to push.
The last, if I can end on one specific thing, it's that, to bridge the anti-vax and the US side, the NewsGuard has an election misinformation tracker, which has almost 150 websites on it, including many right-wing websites like Breitbart and Newsmax. And 60% of the websites we found to be publishing patently false information about the election also publish anti-vax information. So that will be a question for the Twitters and Facebooks of the world, which is, beyond politicians, how do you handle massive news outlets that publish blatant misinformation about things like elections and health?
Yeah.
With that, I think we'll end on that note. Josh, thank you very much. Everybody read his column and check out his book, Chaos Under Heaven, Trump she in the battle for the 21st century. Anna, Sophie, thank you very, very much. It was great to learn a little bit more about NewsGuard, and excited to see you all grow in this awfully complex environment that we're seeing. And Richard, our partner, Digitalis, our co-host, thank you so very, very much for everything you all do. And I urge everybody to look at more closely at what Digitalis does, because it's awfully important and timely work. It's an honor to be with all of you. And in the meantime, have a very, very happy holiday and New Year.
Thanks, Matt. Thanks very much indeed.
Thanks, Matt.
Thank you.
Thanks, Matt.